Alexander the Great, A Story of Conquest and Legacy. Chapter 1, The Birth of a Legend. In the shadowed courts of Macedon, beneath the storm-tossed skies of Pella, a child was born who would shake the foundations of the world. Alexander, son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias, came into the world in 356 BC on the night the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. The priests would later proclaim it an omen. The goddess was too preoccupied with the birth of a world conqueror to guard her shrine. Whispers spread quickly across the land. Olympias, devout follower of mystic rites and serpentine cults, claimed divine dreams had foretold her son's greatness. Some said she was visited by Zeus himself, who came to her as a bolt of lightning. Others spoke of her sleeping with a serpent, perhaps a symbol, perhaps more. To the people of Macedonia and beyond, Alexander was no ordinary prince. He was destined. From the start, strange signs surrounded him. Eagles circled his cradle. Prophets claimed his eyes glowed with the fire of prophecy. And when a seer examined the newborn, he proclaimed, "This child will rule not just Macedon, but all the known world." Chapter 2, The Making of a Prince. As Alexander grew, so did the world's expectation of him. His father, Philip, an indomitable warrior king, ensured his son was not coddled. Macedon was a land of warriors, and its prince would be hardened by battle and bred for greatness. But it was not only the sword that shaped the young boy's mind. Philip summoned the greatest philosopher of the age, Aristotle, to tutor his son. In the quiet groves of Mysa, Alexander studied logic, ethics, politics, and science. He read Homer as if it were scripture and saw in Achilles a mirror of himself. The philosopher planted in Alexander not only the seeds of knowledge, but a vision of a united world governed by reason and culture. From Aristotle, he learned to ask not just how to conquer but why. It was during these years that the first clear sign of Alexander's unique spirit emerged. A great horse, Bucephalus, was brought to court, a powerful stallion so wild that none could ride him. As the handlers gave up, Alexander observed quietly. He stepped forward, calmed the beast by turning it toward the sun where it could no longer see its own shadow, and leapt upon its back. The court gasped as the boy and horse became one. Philip, overcome with pride, is said to have declared, "My son, seek a kingdom equal to your greatness. Macedon is too small for you." And so, the boy grew prince, philosopher, and already a legend. The world awaited, and Alexander, with fire in his veins and stars in his eyes, would soon set forth to claim it. Chapter 3, The Rise of Macedonia. Before the world could know Alexander, it had to reckon with Philip II, the architect of Macedonian power. A brilliant strategist and ruthless statesman, Philip inherited a fragile kingdom beset by internal division and foreign threats. Within a few short years, he transformed it into the most formidable force in the Greek world. Philip's genius lay in innovation. He reformed the Macedonian army, replacing the traditional hoplite phalanx with a new model armed with long sarissas, disciplined to march as one, and trained to fight in complex formations. The companion cavalry, elite horsemen loyal to the crown, became his hammer, while the infantry was his anvil. He forged not just an army, but a war machine. Through diplomacy, marriage alliances, and calculated warfare, Philip united the fractious Greek city-states under the League of Corinth. His message was clear: Greece would no longer war with itself. Instead, it would turn its gaze eastward, toward the riches of the Persian Empire. But even as Philip led, young Alexander watched and learned. At just 18, he stood beside his father at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, a clash that would determine the fate of Greece. When the sacred band of Thebes, the elite heart of the enemy line, threatened to break Macedon's advance, Alexander did not hesitate. Leading the companion cavalry, he struck with precision and fury, shattering their ranks. His courage was undeniable, his talent unmistakable. The battle was won, and Greece bowed to Macedon. Though still a prince, Alexander had stepped onto the world stage as a warrior destined to surpass even his father's triumphs. Chapter 4: A King's Ascension. Triumph was soon followed by tragedy. In 336 BC, during a grand celebration in Egypt, Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. The motives remain clouded: jealousy, politics, betrayal, but the result was clear. The throne now stood empty. Amid the chaos, all eyes turned to Alexander. At just 20, he moved with startling swiftness and clarity. He eliminated rivals, secured the loyalty of the army, and claimed the crown. His mother, Olympias, ensured no threat lingered from Philip's other wives or their children. The prince became king, and the king began to shape the world. But not all of Greece accepted him. Thebes, proud and warlike, saw Philip's death as a chance to reclaim independence. They rebelled, rallying support and sealing their gates against Macedon. Alexander marched south without hesitation. What followed was swift and brutal. In 335 BC, after a brief siege, Thebes fell. Alexander ordered the city razed, its walls torn down, its people sold into slavery, and its memory scorched into the minds of all who might think to rebel. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message was unambiguous. The age of negotiation was over. Alexander was not merely his father's heir, he was a storm, a force of destiny. The Greek world, shaken and silenced, fell into line. With no rivals left behind, Alexander turned his eyes eastward. The boy king had become a conqueror. Chapter 5: The Persian Campaign begins. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander stood on the shores of the Hellespont, gazing across the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia. With him stood a force of 40,000, a mosaic of Macedonians, Greeks, and allies, united under one banner. Before crossing, Alexander paid homage at the tomb of Achilles, binding his fate to the ancient hero he had idolized since childhood. Then, he stepped onto Asian soil, beginning the greatest campaign the world had ever seen. The Persian Empire, vast and rich, was unprepared for the storm descending upon it. At the Granicus River, near modern-day Turkey, the first great test came. Persian satraps had gathered their cavalry and infantry to halt the invaders. Against his general's advice, Alexander led a direct assault across the river's swift current, braving a storm of arrows and spears. The battle was fierce. Persian nobles charged at Alexander, and at one point, he was nearly struck down, his helmet split, his life hanging by a thread. But his bodyguards intervened, and the tide turned. The Macedonian phalanx pressed forward, and the companions rode like thunder. The Persians broke, and the field was won. From there, Alexander moved city to city along the Ionian coast. He liberated the Greek cities long held under Persian rule: Sardis, Ephesus, Miletus. Some welcomed him as a hero, others resisted, and were shown the cost of defiance. In each victory, Alexander presented himself not just as a conqueror, but as a restorer of freedom and order. But these were only the outer walls of the Persian Empire. The heart still beat further east, and Alexander would not stop until he reached it. Chapter 6: Conquering the East. The real test came in 333 BC, at the narrow coastal plain near Issus. Darius III, King of Kings, finally took the field. He brought an army vastly superior in number, stretching across the horizon. Yet Alexander, with the smaller force, was unshaken. When the battle began, he struck with characteristic precision. He drove hard at the Persian left while Darius, at the center, watched his lines falter. Then, like a blade through silk, Alexander led a direct charge toward the king himself. Panic seized the Persian ranks as Darius fled his chariot, and his army crumbled behind him. With this, Alexander had done the unthinkable. He defeated the great king in open battle. Capturing Darius's family, he treated them with unexpected dignity, a gesture that earned him both fear and admiration. 2 years later, in 331 BC, the fate of the Persian Empire was sealed at Gaugamela. On the vast plains of Mesopotamia, Darius assembled his mightiest host, including war elephants and side chariots. But numbers could not match the genius of Alexander. Using a feigned retreat and bold maneuvering, he drew the Persians out of position and again targeted Darius directly. Once more, the Persian king fled, and his empire shattered. Alexander marched unopposed into Babylon, Susa, and finally Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia. The treasures of centuries lay before him, but wealth was not enough. At a drunken banquet, amid a storm of revelry and debate, Alexander ordered the palace of Xerxes set ablaze. Flames danced into the sky, and the city that once symbolized Eastern majesty became ash. It was a symbolic act retribution for the Persian burning of Athens a century before, and a declaration that the old world was dead. From its ruins, Alexander would forge a new one. Chapter 7: The Siege of Tyre and the Egyptian Revelation. As the fires of Persia faded behind him, Alexander turned his gaze to the Mediterranean coast, where the island city of Tyre stood defiant. It was 332 BC, and Tyre, wealthy, walled, and proud, refused to open its gates. The city trusted in its position half a mile from shore, surrounded by the sea. It had withstood every invader for centuries. Alexander, undeterred, resolved to reach it. What followed was a feat of engineering and will. He ordered a causeway, a massive land bridge, to be built from the mainland to the island. Stone by stone, timber by timber, under constant missile fire, his men advanced into the sea. The Tyrians fought back with fire ships, diving attacks, and ambushes, but the Macedonian resolve held. After 7 relentless months, the causeway reached the city walls. In a final, brutal assault, Alexander breached Tyre's defenses. His army poured through the gaps, and the city fell. The siege of Tyre had cost thousands of lives and nearly a year of time, but the message was clear. No fortress could defy Alexander and survive. After Tyre, he marched south into Egypt, where he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Persian garrisons offered little resistance, and the Egyptians, long under foreign rule, hailed him as a divine king. In the ancient temple of Amen at Sai Oasis, deep in the desert, the priests proclaimed him the son of Zeus Ammon. What was once legend now took on the weight of divine truth. It was there, between sand and sky, that Alexander's vision expanded beyond conquest. He founded a new city on the Nile Delta, Alexandria, designed as a beacon of Hellenic culture and a bridge between East and West. It would become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, the first of many to bear his name. But his journey was far from over. Chapter 8: Into the Unknown, India and Beyond. In 326 BC, Alexander crossed into the mysterious lands beyond the Hindu Kush territory, untouched by Persian rule and filled with wonders and unknown dangers. His campaign led him to the banks of the Hydaspes River, where he faced his most daunting foe yet, King Paris, a towering warrior who commanded a vast army and a terrifying new force for elephants. The battle was waged amid torrential rain and flooded terrain. Alexander, ever the tactician, feigned a diversionary assault, then led a surprise crossing upriver. His forces struck from the flank, catching Paris off guard. The elephants roared into the fray, wreaking havoc on both sides. But disciplined Macedonian phalanxes withstood the charge, and the companion cavalry struck with precision. Paris fought with valor until he was captured, blooded but unbroken. When brought before Alexander, he was asked how he wished to be treated. Paris replied, "As a king." Impressed by his dignity and bravery, Alexander not only spared him but restored him to his throne and made him a trusted ally. But the victory came at a cost. The journey had grown long, the men weary. When Alexander sought to march further east, toward the great Ganges, his army, weathered by endless battles and strange lands, refused. At the Bees River, they mutinied. Alexander, furious yet exhausted himself, withdrew to his tent and sulked for days. Ultimately, he relented. A monument was built at the edge of their march, marking the furthest point of their conquest. With heavy hearts, they turned back. The dream of conquering all the known world had met its first limit, not at the hands of an enemy, but from within. Chapter 9. The Twilight of a Conqueror. After years at the edge of the known world, Alexander and his army turned westward. Their return was no triumphant parade but a grueling odyssey through desert wastelands, storms, and rebellion. By the time they reached Babylon in 324 BC, Alexander had become more than a man in the eyes of his followers. He was a legend in motion, and yet one who now seemed increasingly alone. In Babylon, he set about reshaping his empire not as a mere dominion of subjects, but as a unified realm blending east and west. He introduced sweeping administrative reforms, placing Persians in key military and civil positions alongside Macedonians. He adopted Persian dress at court and insisted on the ritual of proskynesis, a gesture of reverence deeply offensive to his Greek companions. His most audacious move came with the mass weddings at Susa. Over 10,000 of his soldiers married Persian women in a grand gesture of cultural fusion. Alexander himself wed Roxana of Bactria, then Statera, daughter of Darius, blending bloodlines with his former enemies. But his policies sparked unrest. To his Macedonian officers, he seemed no longer their king but a foreign autocrat. Murmurs of discontent stirred. Old generals, once brothers in arms, began to question whether Alexander's vision had strayed too far from its roots. Still, the dream endured. He planned new expeditions into Arabia, beyond the edges of any map. Temples, harbors, and new cities were ordered. He spoke of circumnavigating Africa, conquering the oceans, taming time itself. But time had other plans. Chapter 10. Death and Immortality. In June of 323 BC, at the height of his power, Alexander fell in Babylon. He had been drinking heavily, celebrating, planning, pushing forward. Fever gripped him. He grew weak, then speechless. His generals waited by his bedside as the days dragged on and his breath grew shallow. Some whispered of poison, revenge from a wrong general, a resentful satrap, or a plot from within. Others believed it was disease, a fever brought by the marshes, or perhaps exhaustion of a body stretched beyond mortal limits. Still others claimed it was the gods calling home the man who had dared to claim divinity. He died on the 10th or the 11th of June, just shy of his 33rd birthday. When asked on his deathbed to whom he left his empire, Alexander is said to have replied, "To the strongest. The world he built could not hold without him." His generals, known as the Diadochi, divided his empire, warring for control. The unity he forged shattered into pieces, but each piece bore his mark. Cities named Alexandria dotted the map. Greek became the language of elites from Egypt to India, and art, science, and philosophy flourished in what came to be known as the Hellenistic Age. Though the empire dissolved, his legend endured. A man who carved his name into time, who dared to unite continents, cultures, and kingdoms under a single banner. Conqueror, philosopher, king, visionary Alexander died young, but his shadow stretched across centuries. And in that shadow, civilizations would rise. Chapter 11, Legacy of the Great. Alexander died young, but his influence lived far beyond his years. In the wake of his conquests, the ancient world was forever transformed. The Greek city-states had once been small, proud, and divided. Now, the cultures of Egypt, Persia, Mesopotamia, and India had mingled with Hellenic thought, giving birth to a new civilization, the Hellenistic world. At the heart of this transformation were the cities he founded, over 20 in total, most famously Alexandria in Egypt. These cities became centers of trade, governance, and learning. In Alexandria, the great library would later rise, preserving the knowledge of the ancient world and drawing scholars from across continents. Greek became the lingua franca of the Mediterranean and Near East, a bridge language uniting disparate peoples. Philosophy, science, and art flourished. Sculptors blended Greek idealism with Eastern realism. Astronomers like Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference. Physicians dissected the human body to understand its mysteries. Poets and historians reimagined the world not as the domain of cities, but as a vast interconnected stage because of Alexander. And the man himself became myth. Ancient writers like Arrian, Plutarch, and Curtius Rufus cast him as a hero of epic proportions. To the Greeks, he was the new Achilles. To the Persians, a conqueror who respected their gods. To many, he was touched by the divine. Legends sprang up, tales of Alexander flying through the sky in a chariot of griffins, diving to the ocean's depths in a glass sphere, or traveling to the ends of the earth in search of immortality. In medieval Europe and the Islamic world, he became Iskandar, a figure both historical and symbolic, immortalized in epic poetry and religious lore. Even in modern times, his legacy endures. Military leaders from Caesar to Napoleon studied his campaigns. Nations claimed him as their own. Greeks, Persians, Macedonians. His name still evokes the spirit of ambition, discovery, and daring beyond limits. Alexander did not merely conquer the world, he changed it. And in doing so, he became more than a man. He became a story that civilizations would tell for millennia.